It is all about getting Australians back into work, and in 2 years from now, the government expects this debt to pay dividends. That means it will be looking at growth at 4.25%, unimaginable last year. Unemployment to be at 5%, still unimaginable last year as well. But look at this. In 2 years, inflation is expected to be at 1.75%. 1.75%, I should say, but the wage price index is 1.5. So in the short term, wages are going backwards, even with all of this spending. Let's go live now to our business editor, Ross Greenwood. He joins me here in the studio.
That's a big stat, I've got to tell you, and that's a really important one, because if your real wages are going backwards, you're going to get real pushes from unions for wage rises. You've got a bit of real momentum coming here. So the government has got to find some way to really try and make certain they don't get wages growing too fast, but they want them growing faster. So the idea of getting more people into the workforce, giving more childcare places out, giving more incentive for people to go to work, and eventually opening the borders and allowing a flood of workers into the country. That's all holding down those wages. But do remember, the government wants lots of people in work, because really, if it's going to pay for all of this spending, apart from borrowing it, it needs people working, because half of all the money it collects on an annual basis comes from PAYE taxpayers.
Yeah, and we saw those unemployment figures. I mean, yeah, last year it would have been extraordinary for us to be in the position we are. Those projections seem like they are achievable when it comes to unemployment, but it comes back to this issue where we're hearing how good we're getting it here in Australia, but wages growth has been slow for so long, and now the government's saying in its own budget that it's actually going to go backwards from here and not even keep up with inflation.
Well, the little thing you've got to keep in your mind there is house prices, which have boomed and which have therefore triggered construction building boom. All of that is a part of the recovery of Australia. But at some point, that has got to hit a ceiling where if wages aren't rising, even though interest rates are low and people are, like the government, borrowing to the max and feel as though, you know, their interest payments are under control because interest rates are so low, it is still one of those things where you've got to keep a weather eye, as the banks are doing right now, down the track to figure out what happens if this ends? What happens if there is an outbreak of inflation? What happens if the Reserve Bank... Now, they're saying, well, they're going to keep interest rates down very, very low for a long period of time. You get the suspicion that these low interest rates have got to last, maybe even for that decade, simply because maybe the government and the Reserve Bank don't have any alternative, a little like Japan back in the 90s and 2000s, where they had no choice but to keep the interest rates very low, and other things were used to stimulate the economy. Money printing, as the Reserve Bank is now doing, the government borrowing and spending, which it's now doing. So all this is again to try and stave off any suggestion of a recession under Josh Frydenberg as Treasurer, because one day maybe Josh Frydenberg would aspire to be the Prime Minister of Australia.
Well, debt is sexy today, but is it dangerous?
Well, so the government is borrowing at 0.88%. Now, just like any household or business, you know at that point in time that really things are okay. So the encouragement is for business to pick itself up, go and spend, go and borrow. Because what also is said to government is really, and to business rather, is that if you suddenly buy a new piece of equipment and you've got revenues up to $5 billion a year, well, write it off instantly. So you spend $100 million on a piece of new equipment or plant, write it off immediately. You're a small business, you buy a new ute, write it off immediately. So this is all part of the incentive. Or if you lose money this year, well, guess what? We're going to give you money back, because we'll actually dip into the taxes you paid us 2 or 3 years ago, and we'll give you some of that money back. So this is all, again, an incentive to get business to borrow, because one of the big assumptions in this budget is that they can get business investment to rise by 12%. Now, this is massive, given the fact that business has not invested literally for the past 10 years in Australia. So they believe somehow they can get the mojo, what's called the animal spirits, going back into Australian business.
Love it. Animal spirits. So I hope to see those indeed. Now, look, there's always a few little sneakies in a budget, reading between the lines. One of those is $9.5 billion in money allocated but not yet spent. So that feeds us into an election nicely.
A so-called contingency reserve.
Exactly.
Right?
But we're also looking at iron ore. Now, I've called this, Ross, the Australia First budget, because it does look inward. I've got this protectionist feeling about it. It's about Australian businesses creating Australian jobs. And also, in the iron ore price, this goes to our problems with China, I think. At the moment, iron ore, $230 a tonne. US dollars a tonne. The budget assumes that it's $55. So does that mean there's bad things on the horizon when it comes to
And it goes one step further, because there's actually a whole report that says Treasury has modelled it and looked at it and has made an assessment that the budget should have iron ore at $55 a tonne, and that indeed it will go back there in the third quarter of next year. Now, bear in mind that every $10 increase in the price of iron ore is worth about $500 million in tax revenue to the government. So in other words, even if the iron ore price were to halve and went from $230 back to, let's say, it's $120, $115, that's still $60 a tonne, or about $3 billion a year in extra money that the government has got that is really not reported in this budget. And so as a result, if they needed to, new measures, new spending, whatever it might be, they've got the contingency reserves, they've got the iron ore surplus that's going to be there. But as you point out, what is it the Treasury knows that they have not told Australians yet about the relationship with Australia, about the supply of new iron ore coming in from Brazil to China, and indeed any action that might be taken against Australia when it comes to iron ore? It's the last remaining industry that is a necessity to China right now, and it's certainly something that's not fully explained in this budget.
No, and look, one thing just quickly to note is there's not a big spending here for defence, and not big spending for our spy services. For Home Affairs, there's about $1.5 billion, $2 billion, but that's over 10 years. So it's not a huge amount.
I must admit, I thought when I looked at the ASIO funding, I didn't think it was a whole bunch of money.
Considering we've heard about the drums of war, right?
Yeah, that's right, $120 million. You'd think maybe that might have been beefed up just a little, or I wonder what goes under the table with that as well. But there's a few other little bits and pieces. The infrastructure spending for a government that's about jobs and about creating a legacy. The one thing I sort of wonder is when I looked at the infrastructure, and there's been previously announced $110 billion that will be spent over the next 10 years. They need the assistance of state governments to build that infrastructure. But I thought that if you are about creating jobs and a lasting legacy for money that's being borrowed and spent today, there might have been more emphasis on really big infrastructure projects that could change the very nature and productivity of Australia. Because if you want to get wages going, you've got to get productivity going in Australia. That is the absolute key.
Indeed. Ross Greenwood, the New South Wales budget in just a couple of weeks' time. We'll pick apart that too. Thanks
Be
so
great
much.
fun.